Michael the Flem, previous guest. How are you, pal?
I'm good. How are you?
Drinking a cup of coffee. Very good, thanks.
Yeah.
Joining us from Monterey in Mexico. You were on last year, weren't you? And
Yeah.
we talked. It's one of my favorite podcasts. When
It was a
people
good
ask
one.
me to, what it was a good one, and it was one of those things. When you do, if people ask me like, "Oh, you do a podcast and you recommend one," I say, "Okay, go for that one," because it kind of covers a lot of angles what we do on here. And we talked about Atlantis. You did a book on it. You wrote a book. You researched a book, and it was one of those. You had a feeling, an itch, to find out what all this Atlantis nonsense was, and you ended up getting sucked into it and writing a book about it.
Yeah, that's right. That's pretty much how it happened. Like most people, I was just interested in how much was fact, how much was fiction, how much was something else that we really hadn't explored in a serious way. And so that involved going into things like non-local perception, remote viewing, clairvoyance, studying myself, the history of these phenomena, and seeing how they, in some cases, line up with the actual archaeological, historical, and oceanographic evidence. And to my great surprise, going in as a pretty neutral researcher that did not have an agenda, I wasn't trying to prove or disprove. I was just legitimately investigating as a third party, as a history professor. And what I concluded was quite shocking to me, which is the fact that, there's almost undeniable evidence at this point that something was going on before the end of the last ice age. And, as more and more information comes out regarding, say, Gobekli Tepe, which, might seem like old news, but it's still a critical part of this discussion, because so often people say, well, show me one structure on Earth that's from 12,000 years ago. And now we can irrefutably point to that. And regarding this date that, seems quite fantastical to an average historian, or, the average listener perhaps, of 9,600 BC, the date Plato cited in his two dialogues for the so-called fall of Atlantis. I would draw people's attention to, as we go on, maybe you can show the chart, the updated Yuga Cycle chart from the excellent recent book, Yuga Shift, by my colleague, Babu Dev Misra, who out of India discovered actually that there had been a mistake with the standardization of the Yuga Cycle. And so he corrected it based on ancient texts that he had recently reinterpreted. And what he realized was that the Yuga Cycle actually is directly aligning with the Earth's precessional cycle of the equinoxes, the 24,000, roughly 500 year cycle. And what's fascinating is that at the end of, one cycle in that chart, you have that same date, plus or minus 500 years. You have that 9600 BC date, when the Indian epics described a destruction by water, and even described up to 26 comet fragments hitting the Earth, which again is quite interesting if this is all mythology, because in Plato's account, the Egyptian priest tells Solon that the Greek myth of Phaeton, of the boy who loses control of his father's chariot and falls to earth and burns everything up on it, was not a myth, that the Greeks mythologized it, but it really signified an astrological comet strike type event 9,600 years prior to the time of Solon, or rather 9,000 years before Solon, who himself lived sometime around 600 BC. So you start to see all this data from around the world pointing to that time period. And I think that's not something we can ignore anymore. It's also exactly when, in mainstream history or geology, the Holocene period begins. If you go to get a degree in geology from any mainstream university, they're not going to teach you about Atlantis, but they are going to teach you that the Holocene era begins around 9600 BC, when the Earth started warming quite dramatically, and the Younger Dryas period ended, which has been covered extensively. But this new edition, as I mentioned, of the updated Yuga cycle is so fascinating. And it's also fascinating because, as we'll see on the chart, the Kali Yuga, which many people thought we were already out of sometime around the Renaissance, in Babu's new chart, we actually are still in it until March of 2025, when we then go into our own 1200-year window called ekpyrosis, which is the destruction and cleansing by the fire.
Okay.
So we're actually at we're actually at the exact halfway point in a full Yuga cycle, analogous and opposed directly to the destruction of Atlantis within 1,000 years. We're actually in that second part of the cycle, which I think also might explain not just world events and collective insanity of the world, but why there's been such an interest and perhaps renewed vigor in this subject of lost ancient civilizations. I think it's kind of coming up in a kind of Jungian collective unconscious way.
It's so cool. You've just jumped right into it, Michael. And I have to say, you've just you're right up my street. This is one of the subjects I've been looking for. It's funny how whenever I try to find someone to come on and talk about these things, they magically come back in. And funnily, and it was because I listened to a podcast. It's a conspiracy theory podcast, but it's very funny, by a comedian called Sam Tripoli, and it's called the Tinfoil Hat Podcast. And I
was on that show.
It's crazy, but it's fun. I know, and I heard you, and that's why I emailed you back and said that was fantastic. And it's
really a great
cool
show. Sam's a very cool, open-minded person. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, he's good, and it's a huge podcast. So congratulations for that. It's a massive podcast.
Thank you.
And because you are a university professor, you're a professor. You got your PhD. You're an author, a researcher.
Just my master's. Just my master's.
Oh, just your master's, right?
Yes.
Gotcha. Excuse me.
Right.
And
but I worked hard for that master's, believe me.
Yeah, I didn't get that far. So, and then because I watched, I've watched the Graham Hancock thing on Netflix. I've read quite a lot of his books actually, and they're really good. And on one of his, I can't remember if it's a Facebook page or something, but you were the book of the month as well for Visions of Atlantis, which is the name of the book.
That's right. And I did manage to get
the amount of
right. I did get on as author of the month for February, and actually, his daughter emailed me, and because I sent her a copy of the book, and she said he got the book and read it and liked it, and which to me was a kind of personal achievement because he's always been one of my favorite authors since I was a teenager. I think I read Fingerprints of the Gods, when I was in my 21. And it was really just a supreme honor, because that guy, has really, much like 19th century people like Ignatius Donnelly restarted the whole discussion. I put him on the same level because, 30 years ago, he really got this discussion going. It was pretty much dead. And he kicked the door open, and then everybody else followed, And so, love him or hate him, you cannot deny that man was a pioneering figure in reimagining the past. And basically, all research on this subject is indebted to him, And I'm not one of these people just to say, I believe blindly everything he says. We actually disagree probably quite strongly on, he's a much more conservative thinker than me, believe it or not. He said on Joe Rogan multiple times. Now, I'm not saying that they had flying machines and holograms and all the things that other people say. And I am saying that, so he just, stays with kind of, there was an advanced navigator type culture that was able to map the world using kind of advanced longitude and sea travel. But I'm going much farther than that in my claims. If people think Graham Hancock's crazy, then I must be, committed to an insane asylum for what I believe, because The data I've looked at suggests that these people had technology much more advanced than anything we have today.
Yeah. So if you want to go back and listen to what we talked about before, that was one of my longest ones. I think it was like an hour and 45 minutes. And it was episode 71. And it's still to this day one of my favorites. It's just so interesting.
It was a good
one. The
one.
amount of people have come up to me. Yeah, and they come up to me and they say, in fact, one of my good friends is he's gone all in on the book. He bought both books.
Oh, wow.
Your book and A Dweller on Two Planets, which is... That's
good luck with that.
That's
good luck with that book.
That's pretty esoteric, that one, isn't it? There's quite a lot of it goes way over my head, but the story is really good, and
it is.
It's just such a bizarre. The whole thing is so bizarre that I give it.
It's one of the most bizarre books ever written. I've argued this many times. It's one of the weirdest books that has ever been published or conceived, and it's almost impossible to discredit that book. I've read that book 7 times. I'm probably the only person legitimately on planet Earth that has read that book front to back 7 times, close reading, over 2 years, and annotated it, and it's impossible from a standard of motive, if this is all fake, why this kid would have done this and how he knew what he knew. It is physically and almost intellectually impossible unless he truly was receiving this information from what he claimed was a disembodied, disincarnate consciousness that was speaking through him as a kind of medium. So I don't know. But it's been a really interesting time since we last spoke, because you've got more, this is a very active field now. It's not just like a kind of dead thing relegated to History Channel. You've got intellectual academics debating, people like Graham Hancock and others. You've got a lot, I would say, of new information coming out regarding this Yuga cycle. And you've even got more studies coming out of Yale University confirming what Hancock and James Kennett and these people said 15 years ago, which is that a comet strike was likely the cause of the end of the Younger Dryas, and more, even Yale geologists are saying, yeah, actually, that is the best explanation for why the world started to warm suddenly, which again is confirming all of the ancient sources, and so I don't even think they're thinking like that because they think this is all mythology. But my job as an author was to collate every possible data point, and see how they all line up, see how remote viewing lines up with clairvoyance, lines up with mainstream geology, lines up with mythology, lines up with all kinds of things. And to my great surprise, I didn't have to really stretch any of the data. It actually almost all lined up, pointing to this great cataclysm that destroyed whatever culture or cultures existed 12,000 years ago.
Yeah. And it's such a class story. It's such a bizarre story that
it is.
All I can say is go back to episode 71, because we go into it in quite some detail, and it's just so bizarre. It's just, but anyway,
it is bizarre, but I mean, it's only bizarre if you, I think, have a very limited imagination. Often like mainstream history is bizarre to me. You could take any story. The story of Julius Caesar's life is bizarre to me. The story of how, it's in my next book that I'm writing. Julius Caesar was captured by pirates when he was a young boy going to university on Rhodes trying to learn rhetoric. And he managed to convince a pirate crew that he was in charge of the pirate ship, that he could get more money if they kept him alive. He forced the pirates to listen to his rhetorical speeches and then told them, "You're making too much noise. I can't sleep at night." And then came back after he was ransomed and crucified all of them with 500 legionnaires. That's a bizarre story to me. And that's a mainstream historical account, And so it's like, I think if people just pay attention to the details, you would be shocked at even how much of contemporary history is truly boggles the mind, you know. But yeah, sure. The main difficulty, I think, is I'm not going to say brainwashing. That's a kind of overused term, but the indoctrination, consciously or subconsciously, through the educational system,
Conditioning.
through the media, the conditioning. Yes, the operant conditioning, um, which, like it or not, basically is stuck in a very, I would say, kind of teleological sense, you know, fancy philosophical word, which basically would suggest that, look, we have been on an upward trajectory for the beginning of recorded history. So going back to, say, Sumeria, Mesopotamia, that there has been a linear upward trajectory of accumulated knowledge and technology. And that, yes, there have been dips here and there, the Dark Ages, the fall of Rome, things like this. But overwhelmingly, there couldn't be anything more advanced than us that preceded us. This is the predominant paradigm that we are taught. But when you look at decay rates of materials, so aluminum, steel, glass, things like this, they could have had an entire civilization. There could have been the aluminum flying machine that Frederick Oliver describes, the cigar-shaped transmedial vehicle, which he claimed was made of aluminum. But even if it's made out of Atlantean aluminum, it still physically exists, and it's going to decay. And we're not going to have a record of that, you know, on Earth. But what are we going to have? We're going to have megalithic structures that perhaps astronomically point to that date. We're going to have engravings in stone, like at the Temple of Abydos and things like this, or Dendera, that show strange objects that we don't really want to believe what we're looking at. We're going to have Indian stories of Vimanas. We're going to have a lot of things. You know, I would even argue perhaps some of the contemporary sightings are perhaps remnants that never fully were destroyed and not all extraterrestrial. So it's like there's a lot of things that I think you have to just kind of deprogram yourself for. Like, why is it obvious and evident that history always proceeds in a linear fashion? In fact, as my colleague Babu Dev Misra very clearly states, this concept really came about in the 19th century when European societies, utterly dominated in technology, were using technology for colonialism. This is when professionalized evolutionary science, professionalized racism came about. And as Babu says, Darwin knew about the Yuga cycles. And he writes in his notebook, you know, although these other cultures believe history is cyclical and that we are in the kind of negative downward cycle, that's just not a very cheerful way to look at life. And I don't want to accept that. And so I'm going to propose that we as Western Europeans are at the apex of civilization. And we just ran with that. Because relative to, say, Tahitians in 1850, the British Navy was technologically and culturally more advanced. But that's an assumption. You know, it's not provable because we wouldn't have records predating this cataclysm. So recorded history doesn't necessarily just encompass lived human experience. Human beings have been in the same anatomical structure that you and I have been, with a greater brain capacity, for at least 250,000 years. And we are told that they did nothing for 195,000 of those years. And then suddenly, law, writing, religion, megalithic architecture spring up. I don't believe that. I think that's absurd. You know, I think if we could do what we did in go from the 19th century to today, once a critical threshold of knowledge is reached, it's quite quick to go to space travel within 200 years, you know, or within 100 years of less than 100 years of flight. You know, within 50 years of flight, we had rockets. Within 40 years of flight, technically, we had rockets. We had jet propulsion that the Nazis invented. Then we're going to space and nuclear weapons within 40 years, you know, of the closing of the 19th century. So it's like You're telling me in 195,000 years, we were just sitting around a campfire looking at the stars? I don't believe that for a second. I just think it's been lost because the entire world was likely impacted by like multiple, up to 20, according to the Indian epics, comet strikes that destroyed whatever cultures were around.
It's such an interesting subject. We could go right down the rabbit hole again on that very subject, because there's just so much information, and there's just so much you can dive into.
Sure.
But yeah, so I presume you saw that Joe Rogan podcast with Graham Hancock and his name
I
is
did.
Flint Dibble, the archaeologist.
Flint Dibble. Looks like a dibble.
I thought that archaeologist guy did but I thought he did a good job. I mean, he was obviously well rehearsed. The thing for me, and being as fair as I can, I thought he came out very well.
Could have been a lot worse. I think you're absolutely right.
It could have been a lot. I thought it was going to be a bloodbath, but he was obviously, I think, well briefed up. But
yeah,
I didn't think Graham Hancock, he came out sounding a bit like a cranky old man, which that might well be what he is. But what he says, the archaeologist said, is irrefutable, because he's saying, okay, but we can only go by the information we've got, by the research we do and what the things we find, and you can't argue against that, really, and it's absolutely true. But I still think you have to take a bit of a leap of faith, and
well, you can actually.
Also, for me,
you can go beyond that.
And what for me becomes really interesting is when you do take that leap of faith, then suddenly a lot of other things come into focus as well. So it's not just, we talk about Atlantis. And so then you get into things like, the ancient Indus culture, which is going back 8,000 years, something like that. It's a very, very old.
The Indus Valley culture, right?
Yeah, the Indus Valley culture. Yeah. So it's very, very thousands of years old. And we know in the West know very, very little about it. So I did a bit of research, i.e., what it's called research nowadays, what I call reading. And so I found out about the Yuga Cycle. So YUGA is the Yuga Cycle, and it's pretty astonishing, because this is when you start to, even for me, having taken that leap of faith, that leap of imagination, to say, okay, now you're stretching things out, because we're talking about time cycles which make zero sense to anyone, unless this stuff has been written and it's been handed down. And then you find out that it ties in with some other stuff from different parts of the world, which is written on stone, carved in stone, and it ties up. So we're getting to the point of it. So the Yuga cycles, this is what I want to talk about, Michael. And first of all, you have to give us a quick explanation, like a quick and dirty explanation as to what a Yuga cycle is.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would recommend everybody read the book Yuga Shift, which came out after my book, so I couldn't include the data. But it absolutely astounded me what Babu Dev Misra, who's an Indian researcher, a writer for New Dawn magazine, and recently wrote this book, Yuga Shift. What he discovered is quite extraordinary, because, a Yuga cycle, Kali Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, Satya Yuga, these are just words that describe Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and then transitional periods. And there was a lot of confusion for a long time, because certain Indian authors had made these cycles kind of impossibly large numbers, like 4 million years for each Yuga cycle and things like this. And as Babu says, there's a lot of people in India that still come from this old school where they think like the Kali Yuga has always been here because it's 4 million years old or something. But what he realized was that he discovered some other Indian texts that had been overlooked, and he can read that language. And so he compared it to other cyclical timelines that existed in the world, like the Mayan long count, the Greek called the Great Year, the great kind of processional equinox, phenomena that Graham Hancock talks about, which is roughly this 25,000 year cycle that it takes for the Earth to go through its rotation through the constellations, is how we understand it in the West. And so he standardized the chart, and he determined that the actual number is the precession of the equinox, that each of the yugas is a part of that process. So we actually are still in the Kali Yuga, according to his book. I mean, that was a great revelation that he made as an author, was when he discovered, wait a minute, we're 1 year away from the ending of the lowest point of human consciousness on the cyclical Yuga chart. And yet we believe in the West, at least, that we are at the apex of material success, technology, knowledge. But on the Yuga chart, we are literally at the lowest point in the last 12,000 years of human consciousness. And we're going into a 1,200-year transition period of cataclysm, where the earth will be cleansed by the fire. Just like it was cleansed by the water 12,000 years ago, which we call the flood, et cetera, et cetera. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. This is just what the yugas predict. But it's quite astounding that this old Indian chart, which comes from the Mahabharata and other Indian texts, which are at least 1000 BC, so you're talking books from 3,000 years ago, how did these people know that the Ice Age ended in 9600 BC? How? They're supposed to be ignorant people sitting around a campfire rubbing sticks together. How did they know that the Ice Age ended at 9600 BC, which it does? How did Plato know that? How do the Aztecs have these dates? It's because they're all sharing a collective knowledge, I would argue, that comes from a pre-flood culture. You know, one of which was Atlantis. You know, Atlantis didn't rule the world. It dominated the Atlantic Ocean, had empires in North America, had colonies in the Mediterranean. I think I've proven that in the book, but there were other cultures. You know, in Frederick Oliver's account, India was equally as strong as Atlantis. When Atlantis had reached the apex of material technology, it couldn't defeat the Indian culture at the time, who had reached a level of material mental projection that could defeat even the armies and aircraft, as Frederick Oliver goes into great detail describing, like that scene where the Emperor in that terrible recent Star Wars is using, you know, Palpatine is using the electricity to defeat the Star Destroyers above. He describes a scene like that in A Dweller in Two Planets, where the Atlantis airship fleet tries to bombard a city in India, but the adepts are able to mentally reverse the weaponry and destroy the Veil's fleet of the Atlanteans. And so I think you're looking at basically a legacy of a shared knowledge, which, again, obviously spanned the world, because you see megalithic architecture in China, off the coast of Japan. You see it in Nan-Madol. You see it in India. You see it in, I mean, all over the world. So there was obviously a shared understanding of a higher level of, I'm not even going to say consciousness, but a higher level of understanding the scientific realities of time and the cyclical nature of time. And again, we in the West presume through our arrogance that we are the, you know, progenitors of all science and technology. And so therefore, in our extraordinarily myopic view of reality, we just believe that we can measure progress based on what number iPhone we are on that year, and therefore that means we're at the top. You know, whereas I could ask an average person who's older than me, do you think society is more advanced and better than it was in the 60s, let's say? They might say no. Actually, cars were better in the 60s. Life was better. People were smarter in the 60s before the internet. You know, I mean, you can ask people living today if they believe that time is progressing in an absolute upward trajectory, and they'll tell you no. I think economically we can agree on that as well.
So if you remember last time we spoke, I talked about George Lucas, because you know we mentioned we talked about Star Wars. And now that you mention it, in his latest ones, when that guy, just as you described, I reckon he's read that Frederick Oliver book. And the other thing I'm going to mention about Frederick Oliver. So how old was he? 17?
17 in 1886.
1886. He wrote this book
Wild West.
describing basically super
Star
advanced
Wars
technology, things that we've got now. So FaceTime.
Yes, he describes
like
FaceTime, holographic projection, video surveillance. This is in 1886, to put this in perspective, okay?
Yeah.
Video surveillance, magnetic brain reentrainment, and precognitive determinants of crime, so Minority Report, holographic image projection, transmedial aluminum flying craft that are entrained to a crystal, blaster rifle. So, again,
Star Wars.
a council of dark sages that are trying to undermine society. Okay, there's the Sith. The Sons of the Solitude, who possess semi-angelic powers and are trying to preserve peace, the Jedi. He's married to a princess that he talks to on a holographic image in a spaceship, Princess Leia on the Millennium Falcon. I mean, I've always said this, like, if they didn't read A Dweller on Two Planets, then it's even more bizarre, because they're both projecting some kind of lived reality. But again, I always tell people, what is the setting of Star Wars? It's a long time ago. So right on the face of the franchise, even though it's in a galaxy far away, I would say it actually was a long time ago on Earth. And it wasn't called Star Wars. So it was called Atlantis catastrophe, excuse me. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned something about, you were talking about the precession of the equinox, which is called the Great Year. Like you said, it's called the Great Year, the Long Year, whatever you want to call it. But it's around 25,600 years, roughly. We don't know exactly what it is. But it's when the heavens above us turn one full cycle. So you've got your, what do they call the horoscopes? I'm blanking.
I guess you could call them the houses of the Zodiac.
Zodiac. So you got, what are we now? We're about to go into the age of Aquarius.
That's right.
So by the time Aquarius comes back around again, it's going to be, what's before Aquarius? I don't
Pisces.
know any of these things. Okay,
the
so
Piscean
Pisces
age.
is going to come back around again in approximately 26,000 years.
Right.
So this is the big question, how did they know this?
That is the good question.
How did they know that it took 26,500, whatever it is, years? That's the first question.
Yes.
That's a big question in my book.
Yeah.
How do you figure that one out? I've got a lot of questions about the ancient, because how did they manage to measure things so accurately?
How did the people who built the pyramid, which, by the way, Edgar Cayce said was built in the year 10,490 to the year 10,390, that it took 100 years and it was used by levitating the stones using magnetism. That's what Edgar Cayce said in 1932 in a hypnagogic trance. The same trance he used, by the way, to heal thousands of people that he could remotely diagnose without seeing them. And we have sworn affidavits from those people who were healed in an archive in Virginia that I've looked through for 7 years.
What was his hit rate? His hit rate was something like 97%. Yeah.
In some cases, it was 100% actually over the course of years. He made a couple mistakes, and they were like, he would diagnose correctly, but the wrong person in the room. So like Nico was the target, but your son was in the room, and he'd be talking about your son, which is still correct. But yeah, I mean, he said very clearly, he was the first one, to my knowledge, ever to actually say that the Great Pyramid, because it was Robert Bauval in 1983, looking at an aerial map of Giza in the Cairo Museum, that realized, wait a minute, these three pyramids look like the constellation Orion. So he put it into the computer, and he's like, it doesn't line up. But then he did a precessional regression of what the constellations, where they would have been in the past. And so he's going back through the centuries, and when he got to 10,450 BC, the constellation lined up directly over those three pyramids. meaning they were a star map. Like we have at the Hoover Dam, we have a star map in case of a nuclear war to show the future. This dam was built in 19 whatever 50. So they did with Giza, but Edgar Cayce said that date in 1932. Nobody had proposed a date that old in 1932. And yet a man in a hypnagogic trance who had a 97% accuracy rate finding mineral deposits, missing people, diagnosing illnesses. He said that. And when he was asked how, he said through magnetic levitation of the stone. Stone floats through the air in the similar matter that iron is made to swim on a compass. So he's describing some sort of magnetic technology. Which makes sense because I did the numbers, and I don't think most people know this. Like the traditional explanation of how the Great Pyramid is built, first of all, has 2.3 million blocks. Each block weighs a minimum of the weight of a modern SUV. So let me just repeat that. Go outside, look at your Ford Explorer, okay? And then imagine moving 2.3 million Ford Explorers and stacking them in perfect alignment with true north. Now, in the conventional explanation, that's done through slave labor, skilled labor, ramps, pulleys, this and that. Okay, let's just pretend that's possible, which we've never seen evidence that it is, because when a bulldozer tries to move those, the bulldozer falls upside down. But let's just pretend they were really strong slaves or really skilled engineers. The rate at which they would have had to do that, which conventional archaeologists say took like 37 or 40 years to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. The rate that they would have had to do that at would have been, Nico, something like they would have had to move a block into position like every couple minutes for 40 years, 24 hours a day without stopping. Now, I don't know any team that can work at that rate. Now, even in Edgar Cayce's explanation, which is that it took 100 years using Atlantean technology that could levitate the damn stones. I did the math. It would still take, they would have had to, if it was standardized, they would have had to have put a stone into place every 20 minutes for 100 years. Which, again, the impetus to do a project that extreme had to have been extraordinary. And I think Christopher Dunn, who was recently on Joe Rogan and who recently wrote Giza, the Tesla Connection, has conclusively determined at least one of its functions, which was as a harmonic resonant power source that entrained to the natural frequencies of the earth. And I talk about that briefly in my book based on his book, The Giza Power Plant, which this is like an update of that. But this book hadn't come out when I wrote it. So it's quite interesting that you've got kind of these, it would be like if in 12,000 years, if the Hadron Super Collider had been made out of megalithic rocks, but all the machinery was gone, and people just see something and they go like, well, what is this? Oh, it must be a tomb, these simple people, but you don't see all the super colliding technology. So it probably was with Giza. There were probably Helmholtz resonators in the Grand Gallery. There was definitely a capstone that's missing. There were all sorts of gases within the chambers that were being used as like a piezoelectric harmonic resonant thing that brought earth energy up through it and resonated it through the community. And Edgar Cayce said this basically in 1932, before Christopher Dunn, before Beauval, and he was basically, ignored because the average person in 1932 we didn't have Göbekli Tepe. We didn't have Graham Hancock. We didn't have really much to talk about this ancient timeline that this sleeping prophet, this brilliant man had. So my job in Visions of Atlantis was to take all of this 100-year-old psychic data and see how now, in light of new discoveries, certain things lined up. And to my great surprise, almost everything he said has come true. How strange.
I know I know, and I've done a couple of podcasts with one of my friends. We just do it. He and I just sit down together and just talk about how this staggering amount of technology they must have had to build a pyramid. Because how do you build something that big and so precise? Because if you get one measurement wrong, that you're not going to have those 4 perfect edges. In fact, there's 8.
8.
There's another thing we didn't realize. There's 8 faces to those pyramids that no one knows about. Well, very few people know about. So,
well, let me tell you one other thing briefly, that also I don't think a lot of people know. How did these people, first of all, how did they know that Giza was the center of the Earth, divided into 2 hemispheres, if they hadn't mapped the Earth? It's literally in the dividing point of the hemispheres. It also, Christopher Dunn measured the weight of the Great Pyramid, and it's an exact to a decimal point integer on scale of the weight of the Earth. So it's at the center of the Earth, and it's a scale model of the Earth. And actually, the shape is like squaring the circle of a sphere. If you actually look at that as well, that it's a scale model of the Earth in pyramidal form.
Yeah.
So it's
Robert Edward Grant does that.
Yes, he does. And so it's like,
he's good at that.
How could you say that's simply a tomb? Which, again, this is a critically important fact. Where do stories start? My job as a historian of ideas was to trace, when I lived in that world, the origin of ideas. So people forget that ideas have an origin point. Like my mentor, Darren McMahon, he wrote a book called The History of Happiness. And people were like, what history of happiness? Like, how could there be a history? Well, it's because these ideas evolve. The words evolve. They come from a place and they didn't exist before certain times. And I don't think people realize that, like how different the historical discipline has been over the centuries, and sadly, we have entered an age where it's fallen on the communities like your show or alternative, quote unquote, I hate that word, but non-mainstream historians like myself to take these things seriously, because I couldn't give a lecture at Harvard on the history of Atlantis. I would be laughed off the stage. Why? Because these are not institutions of free thinking. They're institutions of people keeping their tenure track positions. And so where do these stories like, oh, it was built as a tomb for Khufu, where do these stories come from? They come from because we actually don't know, but we can never tell our students that we don't know, that the priesthood of academia doesn't actually know something. So our best guess is that it was built as a tomb from Khufu based on basically nothing, based on graffiti that was found over the king's chamber that Howard Weiss probably wrote himself, but there is no record of the building of the Great Pyramid of Giza in a culture that kept extensive records on every single aspect of their life. And yet the biggest monument does not have a record within dynastic Egyptian culture, which would suggest it predated dynastic Egyptian culture, obviously, because if you built something that extraordinary, wouldn't there be a record of it? And there's not. So why is it strange to think
very little
that it's older? Yeah, and I don't think people realize that. I think people think that it's proven that Khufu built it, and that there's some scientist out there that knows that. And I just haven't read that book yet. But what I want to tell the world is actually nobody has proven that Khufu built it. There's zero to little evidence Cheops Khufu built this. And we can't do it today with our technology. Elon Musk could not build the Great Pyramid of Giza if given all the world's resources and all the time in the world. We cannot create those tolerances within particularly the Grand Gallery in the King's Chamber. It doesn't even make sense from an architectural standpoint why you would do it unless, as Christopher Dunn showed, you were creating a precision on a level of a Swiss watchmaker device that needed to survive a cataclysm, that needed to power civilization, and that was impregnable. Because in Edgar Cayce's explanation, the Great Pyramid was built in 10,490 BC, before the coming destruction of Atlantis, by Atlantean scientists in a coalition with members from the Carpathian Mountains and Egypt, in a coalition. That's what Edgar Cayce said. And I believe it. I think that's actually the best explanation.
Yeah. I don't buy how they, the guy on Joe Rogan, this Flint Dibble fella, said it's, copper tools and abrasion. We've seen that. I've seen guys doing that on YouTube.
Copper tools.
Complete horseshit.
It is horseshit. And Christopher Dunn has already shown, as a master engineer who worked in a machine tooling factory, there are drill marks from electric drills on parts of Egyptian archaeological finds that were not built from a hand auger through. I could sit there all day with a hand drill. I don't care if it has a diamond tip. It's not going through a block of red granite. It's not going to, that you can't do that, So in Frederick Oliver's account, he actually addresses that. He says, all these marvels we've built, you must think we have, we're a barbaric culture that has the best slaves, the strongest slaves. He says, no, no, dear reader. The Atlanteans were in possession of the most advanced cutting machines and materials in the world that were the envy of the world. So there you go.
Yeah. What was the one? So what's his name? Uncharted X. Ben.
Okay.
Van Rodovik. Do you ever watch him on YouTube?
I've heard of him, but I've never watched
him.
No.
Channel. Yeah, so his YouTube channel is called Uncharted X.
Mm-hmm.
Uncharted letter X. And he, with Christopher Dunn and his sons, because they are or colleagues. I think one of them is his sons actually who set it up. So they got one of the these little vases they found, these perfect, symmetrically perfect vases they found underneath it. I think it was a Saqqara.
Yes, it was a Saqqara. Yep.
They found 40,000 of them or something, and they're unbelievably to the point that we would very much struggle, because you look at it and it's so precise and they're so symmetrical that you could not do it. It'd be very, very hard to do it today, if not impossible to do it today. So what they did was these guys who are metrologists. So a metrologist is a professional measurer, and they work in the aerospace industry for NASA and for Boeing and Raytheon and all these companies, building precision, absolute precision down to the micron level parts. So it has to be this precise. And so they scanned it with their machines. They scanned this. So this one friend who was his father and him are collectors, they find these vases and they buy them. And so they scanned this whole thing with thousands and thousands and thousands of data points when they measure it. And the precision is not only outstandingly precise to the point that it's, hundredths of an inch precision. It's based on a mathematical constant that, and as some mathematician, I did it recently during when they were doing this experimentation. Some guy watched the YouTube video and said, "Here, I think I figured this one out." And so I'm not going to try and do it, but the pattern, the design, the handles, everything is according to a mathematical pattern. And he shows it. He makes it as a picture. It's fantastic. And so the upshot of this is that these guys who are professional measurers said there is no way in the world that you can do this today. If you could do it today, which they probably could, it would cost you a fortune. But you could only do it. You could only do it if you had the most up-to-date CAD programs that we have now. So it has to be computer designed and computer controlled, with a computer controlled lathe. That's the only way it could be done. And it's not me, some guy sitting in front of his laptop talking to you. That's not me saying that. That is these are genuine, proper, bona fide guys who really know their shit. These are not.
Well, and this is what bothers me so much, Nico, is, why is that kind of information not in mainstream
It's very
history
new.
classes. Yeah, but
It's very
why aren't
new.
we updating Egyptology textbooks to say, hey, look, maybe we don't have all the pictures. However, did you see this? A professional metallurgist scanned all these vases at Saqqara. We couldn't build them today with that level of precision unless we had, AutoCAD and computerized lathes. Um, the thing, the
Which
thing is,
sounds so bizarre, doesn't it?
but I think really the main, the two main hurdles to really understanding what I believe is the true history of humanity are arrogance and Western materialism. And I qualified materialism being the 19th century dead universe materialist atheist strata view of the real world, which is to say that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of brain activity. There is no animating power within me. It's just a series of electrical impulses firing at random. That Darwinian evolution has, solved all the answers of reality, and that progress is purely, upward trajectory and can never end. Whereas in reality, all three of those things are not even close to being provable, let alone reflected in reality. From even recent history, as I mentioned, I think if you look at the history of the United States, it is cyclical, and we are on the end of that cycle. I don't think anybody would say that 2023 USA is better than 1997 USA. I don't know anybody that would really say that. Like, oh yeah, it's better now than it was in the 90s. Like, nobody would say that. So that's right there. The cyclical problem is real. But number two, the Central Intelligence Agency, who I wouldn't say is a bunch of, silly people. These are people responsible for assassinating some of the world's most famous people, overthrowing governments, preserving a shadow government for 67 years. I think that's a quite impressive achievement. They used remote viewing for military purposes, including to rescue hostages. And you can read the Stargate files. You can listen to Pat Price and Lynn Buchanan and all the people that used those non-local clairvoyant powers to remotely view past, present, and future timelines for the Central Intelligence Agency. But yet we still think that it's just Miss Cleo that uses this, that no serious person uses remote viewing. And it's like, no, a lot of people have. There's a great book on the history of clairvoyant archaeology called The Secret Vaults of Time by Stephen Schwartz, who studies clairvoyance and non-local perception professionally at an institution today. And, he has used remote viewers to find like shipwrecks and missing treasures and things like this. And so when you see the accounts of, say, Edgar Cayce or Frederick Oliver, my two main clairvoyant sources, they are using a technology of the mind, which I think more and more as time goes on, we're starting to understand how it works, which is to say that distance is a kind of human, almost like a Kantian synthetic reality perception that we've created. But in reality, everything is linked at a kind of quantum entangled superpositional level. And so therefore, time itself can be accessed because you're not going back to 10,000 BC or whatever. It's kind of existing concurrently, but your attention is on this timeline, is the best way it was explained to me.
Yeah.
And so there is a
Well,
Nico
it's
running concurrently right now in that
an
cycle.
infinite.
Yeah. It's just our attention happens to be here for a particular lesson perhaps we need to learn here. I don't have the answers. I'm not God. But these are kind of simplistic ways to explain what's probably an impossibly complex process, like accessing the Akashic records or the non-local field. But I also tell people, consider the fact that like Rupert Sheldrake pretty much proved that there is this thing called the morphic field, because as he showed, when one group of animals from the same species learns a new skill, how to build a new nest, let's say, the other populations download that knowledge without observing it in another part of the world, which suggests there is a species, or, some sort of species-wide cloud computing phenomenon where it's like we're all uploading and downloading from that cloud source, is how we simplistically describe it, because we're so obsessed with computers and stuff like that. But for Edgar Cayce, he called it the Akashic Records, because in 1932 there were no personal computers. So he was calling it the Akashic Records. But I even find that interesting, because in Sanskrit, Akasha means sky or ether. So he's talking about Ethernet, I would argue. And it's quite interesting that we deny ether exists in the post-Newtonian world, but yet we use Ethernet right now. We call it the Ethernet. We don't call it the dead materialist net or the dead universe net. We say Ethernet, but then we teach students, well, people before Newton were, they thought ether was real, and we know ether is fake. And how interesting that we still use the terminology of the ancient system, or the Tesla conception of reality. Tesla absolutely believed in ether, and I wouldn't say Tesla was a stupid, frivolous person. He invented electricity that we use today. So,
if you think about it this way, Michael, and this is just me spitballing, using my imagination, I guess. What we have now, we've got cloud computing. We can access it quite easily, but we need machines. So basically, it looks to me as if we are a microcosm of what the macrocosm would be.
Absolutely.
Of other people can access information telepathically, or however it comes, or if it's channeled naturally, whatever it's going to be, naturally. That's Earth, and that our where we live, the planet we live on, wherever we are, and in a smaller scale, it's the same thing, and it's the technology.
Absolutely.
Is the technology is being copied somehow by people who maybe have had that experience before and gone, okay, we need to build a cloud system, but how do we do that? And you see where I'm getting at? I'm trying.
Yes, and it's always been the case. It's always occurred to me that, again, it's our ignorance and our arrogance to presume that it's the opposite way. So you have all these goofballs running around talking about the universe is a simulation, and I'm like, see, this is why you need to have somebody come in from a philosophical professional perspective, because it's like, that's a philosophical question. Are we living in a simulation? And it's a very simple question to reduce to its components, because it's like, well, let's just look at the order of that question. And it's like, we created computer simulations in the 20th century. And yet the universe has existed for whatever, unknown billions of years. But because we have this little thing that approximates how reality could work, we then retrospectively think, well, they got to be a computer sim. We got to be in an operating system. And it's like, think about how stupid and arrogant that is. Well, we've got to be in some sort of giant iPhone or some sort of giant Windows. It's like, yeah, or, our operating systems, as you mentioned, are a fractional, very simple, silly copy of the natural order, which previous to computers we just called nature, but now everything has to be filtered through this dead psycho-techno, whatever, new world order BS, transhumanist crap at the top level, because these are the people that dominate culture and media and are force-feeding the next generation all their horse shit. So any explanation that we couldn't be at the apex, that we couldn't be God, is impossible for these. Tell Yuval Noah Harari that he's just a product of stupid historical forces, and he would tell you, "Oh, that's impossible because I'm going to upload my consciousness into a computer," and it's like, really, bro?
Good luck with
Really?
that.
You could go first, and I'll watch, and I'll turn the computer off after you upload it and throw it out of the window.
Exactly. That's getting thrown in the sea. But,
that's getting thrown off the top of the pyramid, probably, just to make sure.
When you think about it, if we went back, and we're 100 years, not even 60 years, 50 years, and we were doing this, and some people from that time walked in.
Oh my God!
We said, "Hey, look, listen, he's over there in Mexico. I'm here. We can talk. We're recording it, and we're going to upload it into the cloud, so that people can."
They wouldn't know what you're talking about
and listen if they want. And they go, okay, so they'd see this. They'd probably go away and primitively invent some sort of laptop, but they'd get the idea that there's something's going on. We have to access, somehow put this information. We have to create the communication links and blah, blah, blah. And I would say give it 50, 60 years. It probably would figure it out. I'm not
sure.
Initially, it would be incredibly crude, kind of like what we're in now. So I've got I really want to get into the Yuga thing. I know this is so important. It's such an interesting conversation so far. But when we talk about the Yuga, but the first thing before we go into the cycles of the Yuga, so you have the Golden Age, which I'd love to be in a Golden Age. It sounds pretty nice. Silver Age, not as good as the Gold, but still pretty good. Bronze Age,
orders of magnitude better than where we are, though. Sure.
A hell of a lot better than we are right now. In
well, we're at the
Age.
bottom,
now,
so it can only get better than this. That we're at the
very
literal
bottom
end
of the wheel. Yeah,
yes,
so we've basically just gone through that, squelched through that puddle full of shit, and we're hopefully going to come out the other side. Now, I've got a theory here, Michael, and I'm going to throw this one at you and tell me what you think. So,
okay.
It's not just me. I don't think it's just me. Everyone I speak to, I cannot believe, because my daughter was born 2020. So she's a little COVID baby.
Oh, wow.
Just had a birthday.
Don't say that.
Just had a birthday. Yeah. Just had a birthday a couple weeks ago.
Oh, congratulations.
And
that's awesome.
Thank you. And so 4 years ago, we couldn't go. We had to stay some people had to stay in our houses. People lost their jobs. People couldn't go to school. We weren't allowed to go to bars and restaurants. 4 years ago. That was 4 freaking years ago.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
I have a theory that because this particular part of the Yuga, the cycle of time, is so shit that a gracious being, our gracious God, or whoever it is up there looking down for his children on Earth, I'm hoping that's the case. He kind of presses the fast forward button a little bit. I think he does, because it's something's, or she, whatever, that being, that benevolent being, hits the fast forward button and said, like, we're going to try and make this as quick as possible because it's terrible. I don't know. I just thought, because, I remember when I was a teenager, when I was probably 16, and I was speaking to a girl who was 19-year-old about, when you leave school, you go to university, and then the first year of university goes past like a blink of an eye.
Yeah.
Go, all right, I'm still at school, and it looks like the clock's going backwards. I remember this very clearly. It just everything took forever. Car journeys took forever, and so. And then I spoke to a babysitter. She's probably about 15. She's 15, 16 now, and I said, about time speeding up. And I said, look, sorry, that sounds like an old man thing to say. And she says, no, I feel it too. It's just
I do as well.
I kind of
that's very funny, because I was just talking about this with another podcaster, how I absolutely perceive time differently in the last 5-6 years. Even pre-COVID, I started to realize something is quickening or speeding up. But particularly in the last year or two, like, I cannot believe it's almost June right now. I feel like I'm still in January. Like, I looked at the clock, I was like, wait, what date is it? What? And it's not just that I perceive time. It really does feel, even on like a geopolitical level, that there is, like you said, a fast forward button. Wars that used to take 25 years to resolve, or issues that would just drag on. It's like we're speeding up everything. We're speeding up Ukraine. We're speeding up Israel. We're speeding up the decolonization of Africa. We're speeding up the economic free fall, super mega inflation of the US dollar. It's like, as you mentioned, it's like, okay, get ready. Like, the roller coaster is coming. Like, we're at that March 2025 end of the Yuga cycle, Kali Yuga. And I always tell people, like, if these are not the end times, and I don't mean end in a Christian eschatological, like the end of time, whatever that even would mean, but if these are not the end times of this shitty cycle, then what would that look like? Like, what more would you need to be in that end? Like, medical fraud on an unprecedented scale, deception on an unprecedented scale, the president of the United States, a brain dead, corrupt geriatric, the Trump phenomenon, the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, the insanity, the satanic Super Bowl, satanic Hollywood, P. Diddy, Epstein. Like, how many more things need to hit before you go, hey, you know what? Maybe we really are at the end. Maybe this really is the end of this timeline. It doesn't mean you're going to die. And if you're going to die, shit, isn't that cool to go out at the end of the goddamn Kali Yuga? That's pretty spectacular. But it's like, something is dying. And it's certainly the old world that you and I grew up in is gone. I tell people sometimes, my students, I'll be 40 years old in July, but I tell the students sometimes, like, about growing up in 1990, 92, and just how people were, and how just there's certain things that were worse, there's certain things that are better, but I'm like you guys don't even understand what freedom is. You grew up in the surveillance state post 9/11. You, like your daughter, you grew up in a medical tyranny. You were born in a crazy medical Orwellian dystopian moment. I was born in the Reagan era, we didn't believe any of this shit was coming. And how lucky I was to live in both worlds, because I think I still know what it is that we no longer have. And so if you've been free, then they make you the slave, like in 12 Years a Slave. It's really hard to stay the slave once they capture the free man first. It's easier to be born into slavery and not know any better. So I think there is still a group of people out there who remember what it was like, and how it like, even like you said, in the sense of time passing, it's dramatically different now. It seems like a year takes 4 months, which is scary.
I was just thinking, I was actually chatting to a friend of mine who's actually current, because I used to live in California when I was a kid, so age of 10 to 13.
Okay.
And, that was pretty peak, because that was amazing. That was a fantastic place to be at that time.
Sure.
I was there a few years ago, Northern California, near San Francisco. Dump.
Mm-hmm.
I would not go back there.
Oh, it's like Somalia now.
Yeah, but I would say, and
no offense to Somalia,
this, older people say this, but it's one of these things. I reckon mid to late 90s, up to about 2005, 95, let's say, to 2005 was peak, because there was mobile phones, but they couldn't take pictures. It was used for speak to your parents, speak to your family, speak to your friends, and
no YouTube.
Go and meet your pals. And there was no social media. That didn't exist. The internet was new, but you could just email your friends. It was becoming really useful And it was
Right.
actually peak. It was great. You could get free
I
music.
would agree with you, actually. Yeah, I would say that
Just leave
1999
it there.
2000 to me was
Yeah.
a time period that will never be understood unless you lived in it. Because, like you said, 99 2000, it's like you're watching the internet emerge and you're like, oh my God, like this is crazy. I can talk to people in other countries. I can download music for free. I can like look things up after going to the library my whole life. But there wasn't this like false reality called social media that was all encompassing. Like people still lived in reality and still talked to people, but used technology as a tool to augment reality instead of supplant it. And now it's like if you don't have a phone on you and you're a cyborg walking around, you're like a weirdo ostracized from society, or how dare you
Yeah.
go up to Nico in a cafe and try to speak to him on his noise canceling headphones as he's, live streaming a game or something like that. You know what I mean? In a cafe. So I think you're
No,
right. Like we really are in some sort of like, in the Matrix, they were all plugged in pods, in rows, in some dystopian thing. Well, we're in it, but we're just walking around the kind of last memories of reality. We're walking through the streets. We're in the cafes and the restaurants, but we're not really there. We're really in the computer screen or the phone screen. Absolutely. So in that sense, it's another clue that we've checked out on this cycle, because the part of the Kali Yuga, which, if you'll excuse me for a couple minutes, you could put that chart up while I'm grabbing another coffee
sure.
here. But the Kali Yuga isn't just material degradation, like destruction. It's spiritual and consciousness level degradation. So it's not just like wars and deception and slavery and all the things we think. It's on a personal level, people's integrity and their ability to perceive reality is at an all-time low. Which again, I think, would you have an OnlyFans in the golden age? Probably not. Would you have a Facebook in the silver age? Probably not. No, they don't have any need for these things. But we think these are great liberating forces for, the young generation to exploit yourself and, make money so that you can, again, do what with your money? Make more videos and get more followers. And again, it's like, okay, at a certain point, the universe is like, okay, it's send the comet. Like, we tried, they're done, blow it up. Try again.
Yeah, it's for some. Can you see my screen just now?
Yeah. Yeah. And let me
can you see that?
give me. No, I can't see anything.
No.
Give me one moment. I'm be right back, Nico.
Okay, go for it. And I will try. So what we're looking at here, if I can, I don't know why I can't find it. Here we go. Okay, right. So I'm just about there. So they're going to pull up an image, which is here. There we go. And that is there.
Okay. I'm back.
What the heck happened there?
Did you share or did I share?
No, I think I don't know what happened there. Sorry, I just
let me see if
just tell me.
Let me see if hold on a second. Let me see if I can share the Yuga chart.
Yeah.
Okay, give me one moment here.
You did it before.
I did.
So we're talking about the Yuga charts, which is very interesting because we don't know how old they are. We don't know when they were written. It describes these cycles. They're of different. They're not just. It's not split into 4 equal parts. Not like there we go.
Okay. So I'm going to leave this up. You can see this, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
this
I
is
can
the
see it. We can
chart.
see it.
This is the direct chart that was corrected by my colleague Babu Dev Misra in his recent book, Yuga Shift. And it's quite fascinating because if you look here, you'll see obviously these names like Satya, Treta, Dwapara, Kali. Satya being golden, Treta silver, Dwapara bronze, I believe, Kali iron, the worst. And you'll notice that we are in 2024 at the final year of the, 5400 Kali period, really 5700 because there's a 300-year transitional period between the yugas. And so you'll notice also that the Greeks used this and they called it the Great Year. And these are Greek words, kataklysmos and ekpyrosis. And you'll notice that in the adjusted chart, the kataklysmos period of 1200 years is the window in which mainstream science will tell you the Younger Dryas period existed and ended
That's exactly what it's
within.
called as well.
Right,
Same time period, 1200 years.
right. And so, how did they know that the Younger Dryas existed for 1200 years and that the world was destroyed by massive flooding caused by comet impacts? I would say that's quite astounding. Number two, look at the period we're going into. From 2025 to 3225, there is a 1200-year window of destruction and cleansing by fire before we get to the ascending Dwapara cycle for the next 12,000 years until we reach again the golden age that was Atlantis and are destroyed again in the cataclysmos 12,000 years after that. So again, it's
So,
it's quite humbling to look at this chart because it flies in the face of everything we're taught. That we're going to Mars soon and we're going to be eating in the Whole Foods cafe with Elon in a couple years.
which, and what also I find pretty, the hubris. It's my new favorite word. I've been using that a lot lately as
Oh,
well.
great word.
Hubris.
Great word.
Great word. Just whenever you feel like you've got everything under control, that you know what's going on,
Yep.
something comes smacks you. It's basically overconfidence, I think you would call it,
It's
and
beyond overconfidence.
arrogance.
It's a Greek mythological level of arrogance that is smacked upside
Yeah.
the head by the gods, or a comet fragment that blows up your city and your civilization. And this is interesting also that in Plato's account, in his dialogues, and I mentioned two things I'd like to mention about that because one of the main criticisms people have is how do you reconcile Plato's description of essentially a Bronze Age culture? There's no high technology mentioned in the dialogues. There's no flying machines. There's no levitation. It's just a Bronze Age culture that he put at 9600 BC. How do you reconcile that with the high technology? Well, I do have an explanation, and it comes from Edgar Cayce and Frederick Oliver's accounts, which, as I mentioned, I use these people because they were the first ever to channel this story, meaning they had no outside channeling influences or popular culture references to draw on. But they said basically, they both said that the peak of this Atlantean culture was around 11,000 to 10,800 BC. That's when it was at its actual material apex with technology beyond Elon Musk right now. But because of a corrupt transhumanist leadership who divorced themselves from materiality and became, quote, as electricity, this is what Frederick Oliver said, they abandoned the general population who didn't remember after 400 years how to maintain the technological infrastructure, and they lost the phones, and they lost the flying machines, and they fell into a state of aggressive, primitive barbarism, but still lived in the infrastructure of this highly advanced region, in the capital city of Poseid, in the capital of Kaiful. And in A Dweller on Two Planets, he fast forwards 1,000 years of Atlantean history. And he's like, now see the city. And it looks like an Aztec sacrifice temple. You know, they're in this highly advanced science lab, but they're using human sacrifice because they've forgotten how to use the computers and everything. And so it's my argument that that was the point that was transmitted to Solon, was the third and final iteration of Atlantis after it had already declined into this barbaric civilization that was invading, if you recall in the Platonic dialogue, the Mediterranean, and which some remnant of the Athenians defeated before they could do it. And then the cataclysm happened anyway after the Athenian or whatever victory over Atlantis and destroyed that world by a comet. That's what the Egyptians told Solon. The other thing is just the kind of modern day analog with what Plato said about the final part of that dialogue. He's like, to those that had no eyes to see, I'm paraphrasing, they appeared at the height of their power and glory. But to those that could really see, they knew that this society was doomed and corrupt and basically drunk on its own hubris. And I thought to myself, that is the modern West. On every level, that is the modern Western world. Is we really are drunk on our own power and hubris, and the reckoning is coming. You know, and I'm not a biblical revelation, repent before the rapture type person, but something is coming. Whether it's divine judgment or natural disasters or a nuclear war, God forbid, or something, there is no undramatic conclusion to the events that have been leading up to this point, is how I'll describe it. Simply, to me, statistically, it's impossible that you could even continue at, like, we have reached this, like, the speed in the car going down the hill is too fast. Like, there's no amount of brakes that you can put on at this point. And there's black
and the wheels
ice,
are about to come off,
and the wheels are coming off, and the transmission is broken, and there's a lot of people in the car, and it's like,
do you know how many
you ain't
people
gonna stop.
Do you know how many people I speak to nowadays? And this has become a thing. It's actually, it's almost like a party trick, is to, and I spoke about this in another podcast, is to basically create, when I say commune, I'm not talking about being communist, but it's a retirement home idea. And we talked about this in a podcast, a few podcasts ago with my friend, is to buy some land with some friends, whoever wants to come, good people, people you get on with. And they go.
I'll tell you in a second. Keep going.
Build a little houses, because we're getting to the when you start to think about it. I don't want to be living the rest of my life in a care home, being drugged and that's just forget that.
I'll never go into one of those places.
No, absolutely not. So it's basically you basically not go off grid. I wouldn't say off grid, but you
can't go fully off grid. No,
you need.
Nor would you want
societal
to
support, but
you do.
But you want to be off as much as independent of this complete rubbish modern life that we have to suffer right now as possible. Yes. And everyone's like, yes, I'm in. Because I think everyone's looking around going, I can't make head or tail of this. I'm making good money, but where's it all gone?
Oh my God.
You think that you're doing all right, and then what the hell?
No, and it's so interesting you say that, because I've been living in northern Mexico for 3 years in a beautiful city that has everything and more that I had in Chicago at a third of the price. I mean, I was shopping the other day and I bought, just the amount of groceries I would use for a week. And I'm like, this would cost $500 in America. And it just simply doesn't cost that much here. And I told my friends, like, what good does it do? I mean, I have a friend who makes $120,000 before taxes as a coder, and she was a bartender 2 years ago. And you'd think, wow, that's a tremendous success. Like, you make over $100,000. Like, nobody can make fun of that. She's like, yeah, but I don't have any money at the end of the month. Like, my rent is so high, food is so high, my car insurance, the taxes. Like, at the end of the day, like, I have the same standard of living as you. And, you know, you just write books and teach a few hours a week. And I'm working full time.
Yeah,
and I'm in another tax bracket. And so it's like, you're absolutely right. Like, the idea that, you know, from my grandparents' generation, where both of my grandparents on my mother's side were basically high school educated high school teachers in the 1960s and 70s, but they could, you know, both buy a home, 3-bedroom home in Massachusetts on the ocean with cash. And it's like, that's gone, man.
With savings,
you know, that's done.
Savings.
Yeah, that's done. And so,
car
again, I always tell people, like, look, you know, enjoy the show. You know, you could sit around and bitch about it all day, but you ain't going to change that Yuga cycle. You know, nobody can change that. That's just a fact. And I'm not saying it's inevitable, and I'm not saying I know what's going to happen. And you should be very wary of anybody that tells you they know what's going to happen. But what I can say is that, look, as incontrovertible as science can be, all points to the Ice Age really did end 9,600 BC. That's not Edgar Casey channeling. That's just what core samples say, that there was some massive change. And the best explanation we have is probably something hit the Earth or multiple comet fragments from the toroid asteroid belt, whatever. Well, if these ancient people knew that, and if they created a system that does, again, accurately predict how long it takes for the Earth to, in real life, non-mythological reality, go through the constellations. If they knew those two things, maybe we should listen to them. If they say that we are in the Kali Yuga and we're going through 1,200-year period of utter transformation of planet Earth. I think it's absurd to ignore that and think, oh no, it's actually, we're in the golden age, and, you know, like, there's no evidence for that, you know, because, again, part of the problem within the Kali Yuga is you don't even have the consciousness to realize you are in it, basically, is how one person has described it. Like, you're too stupid and delusional to even acknowledge that you are in that stage. For those that are truly in that, like, endless progress mindset, like like the WEF and the transhumanists. I'm not saying your listeners are too stupid, but these World Economic Forum psychopaths who believe that it's just going to keep going and getting better and better and better and better and better. You know, we just have to kill everybody on Earth, and, you know, then we'll be the gods. And it's like, no, you're included in this set of ingredients as well, buddy.
No one gets out of here alive. I reckon our overlords, Michael, know this, and they're building their dumbs, the deep underground military base. They're trying to get underground, and they're going to be the ant people, as it they used to call them. The Hopi Indians used to call them.
That's
ant
right.
People, who saved them when they got the last. Cataclysmos. It wasn't ekpyrosis last time.
It was cataclysmos.
So that was water, floods. And so, so there's a guy who I've been following. As I read his work every day. He's a finance guy, but his name is Martin Armstrong. I'm familiar with him. ArmstrongEconomics.com. So he very much believes in cycles, and he's built his model. He was a programmer in the 60s. Programmer. Wow. He used to build computers. Yeah, so he understands, and then he started understanding cycles. And so basically, he's done very, very well. So he has one of the second largest coin collections in the world.
Wow!
Against some Norwegian billionaire, and he uses the gold content in the coins, and he uses clay tablets from Assyria Sumerian
Wow.
times that are futures contracts for wheat prices and stuff. And he's charted all
Right.
the rises
Right.
and falls of civilizations based on
Mm.
the amongst loads and loads of other things,
Hmm.
on the value of their currency. So they always devalue the currency, and then the currency goes to shit,
Right.
and then no one uses it, and then the civilization collapses. So it's yeah. So
Makes
his
sense.
cycle picks up, and it picks up dates, and it's really quite precise for things that
Mm.
happen. And he says that ultimately, this is the good news, that ultimately these psychos, the WEF and UN and all these nut jobs who just don't know, I just don't know what they don't know what they're doing, even though they
No.
think they know what they're doing. They're just hastening the end, in my
Yes.
opinion. And so he
Yes.
says that ultimately they fail, and
Mm.
post 2032 we have the opportunity to come out the other side and build a better system. Now,
You know,
I know there's still 1,200 years.
that's such an interesting thing you just said, because I've, from four other sources, totally unrelated, economic. One was a channeled source. The other was in Vedic, two different Vedic astrologers, not even using like spiritual components, just using astronomical observations of when this planet aligned at this point in history, this happened. They all point to 2032 as that critical
Really?
aperture for when we then rebuild. Like from now to 2032, almost all of them say, if you think this is bad now, you ain't even seen,
No,
like you're not even at the top of the
exactly.
roller coaster. You're still going
And
up
that's what he
Space
says too.
Mountain. Yeah, like you're still going up
He,
Space Mountain. This has all just been the
yeah,
prologue to the nightmare that's coming for the next 8 years. For some people,
yeah.
as many people say, like, look, two people can be living in prison. One just believes this is the worst experience. The other's like, no, I've got friends, I've got books, I've got shelter, I'm learning, I'm going to get out. So it's really how I look at it. Like, I wouldn't even want to, maybe I'm just a weird person, but like, I wouldn't want to go back now to that old world pre-COVID, because that world to me, people were not talking about anything interesting.
No.
Now people, whether they like it or not, have to confront how the world really works. Now that all the Epstein, P. Diddy, Nickelodeon, Mickey Mouse, all that shit now, you have a daughter. Like, you can't just pretend like, oh, yeah, like things are,
Can't watch
there's
that
a
anymore,
couple
love.
people that are bad. It's like, no, this is a systematic psychopathic culture. Everything is a lie. And then you see basically, your friend, like the economic numbers. Just my favorite is just the US debt from a arithmetic perspective. Like, uh you cannot fix this. And yet
No.
you have to pay minimum credit card payments, but the United States doesn't have to pay its $33 trillion minimum credit card payment, that it can never pay off. And it's like, so your own government has been hijacked and spent into oblivion, meaning they don't care about the future. And yet they're telling you on fiat authority that you better pay your taxes, you better go to work, you better save your money because it's going to be worth something. Whereas, like you said, they're behaving as if it's going to zero, and it's the
Mm-hmm.
final exploitation, looting, power grab of
It
just
is.
the lifeblood of these Western countries. The just sucking the last drops of juice out of the Western world before they go into their bunkers for whatever's coming. I
Yeah.
think is absolutely the
And
case.
they seem to, and they seem to think that they're just going to. People seem to think that they got money, and they've got their underground bunker. The food will eventually run out. I don't care
Yeah.
how many people you bring underground with you. Something's going to happen. You need people around. We've
Well,
built this civilization over thousands of
also,
years.
I
And
think
the
people
other thing
forget.
is,
Well, I was just going to
yeah,
say
sorry,
really quickly. I think people forget, like,
yeah,
these psychopaths. They can't be alone. You know, their personality is premised on being in the spotlight, dominating people. So I don't think they're going to be happy in isolation, anonymously underground. You know, I really don't think that works well for people like that. You know.
And it's probably going to be their number two that knifes them in the back as soon as they get down there anyway. Just takes it all. Because that's what they've been doing all their lives, and it's going to happen to them too. That's the way it works.
Well, it happened to Trotsky, you know, the ice pick.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I mean, he was a leader of global communism that was murdered by his gardener on orders of Lenin. So it's like, nobody is above the law. Hitler's high command tried to put a bomb under the table and detonated it, you know, and Hitler was one of the most popular leaders in that regime and timeline. So it's like, yeah, you're right. Alexander had multiple assassination plots. Alexander the Great, you know, they tried to poison him multiple times. So you're right. Like at the top, it's quite lonely, and you're not above the rules of the game. And you see, that's the point that I don't think most people understand, is because, you know, we haven't had a precedent of, say, besides like the Tunguska event, which flattened like 400 square kilometers, which again, nobody really knows what it was. NASA thinks it was a fragment of a comet.
Million.
Yeah, what am I saying? Excuse me. What am I saying? And it's like,
that was a fart.
Right. And it's like, imagine if that had hit
that one.
Imagine if that had hit New York City. I mean, that's Beijing. All we would have been talking about for the next 100 years, how to prevent this from ever happening. But it happened in a remote part of the Siberian tundra where very few people were even aware it happened. They just heard this boom, you know, because it happened 120 years ago. So we didn't have modern technology to tweet a picture of the blast radius. But it's like, that really did happen. And imagine if that happened on a scale 20 times larger, 26 different times, as Babu and the Indian epics claimed it did happen during that cataclysmos period, with the big one being the one at the final 9600 BC fall of Atlantis date. We don't have a precedent for that. So we just think like, oh, we'll build bunkers or we'll build this. And it's like, no, there's really no way to mitigate that kind of damage, you know, and it's really a miracle any humans survive that. We should be very grateful for their, you know, contribution.
Yeah. So basically, it's going to get worse. You're going to get to the 2025, 2026, 27, I think is his prediction, is the height of the war. So it's great news. And then after that, US is going to break up.
That's so interesting.
Anyway, but the good news
these are the same dates these are the same dates. You know what's funny? These are actually the same dates I just came up with through common sense. You know, I don't have fixed dates, but I have like 2 to 3 year projections I always make, and I write them down and I put them in a drawer. And for the last 6 years, they all came true, basically within a couple months of what I just using everything in my toolbox. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the end of I mean, really think about this. It's not like the world revolves around America, but America in the Kali Yuga kind of is the center stage, I would say, of the thematic decline of societies globally and the rise of others. But in terms of the Western world, America is still the symbolic leader, you know, like the Atlantis type progenitor culture. And I'm not saying it's the best. I'm just saying that's how it's perceived. And I think it's quite interesting that, I mean, think about this. The Kali Yuga ends March 2025. That's right after the final inauguration, if there even is an election, of the next U.S. president.
If there isn't.
And the hell let loose that is going to happen no matter who wins. You know what I mean? So I think that's quite fascinating that
100%.
The election, like the inauguration of what I would think is actually the final president of the United States. And I'll go on record as saying there will never be a presidential election after this. There won't be a United States by 2032. There isn't a United States right now. There's a divided states of America that I think will be formalized in a subdivisional autonomous zone of Texas, the autonomous zone of California, the autonomous, region of Wall Street, DC. But I do not think for a second that we're going to have a regular election. I know that's not going to be permitted.
Again.
Yeah, we're not going to have even, I don't think, the possibility that the one they don't want is going to even get close to that office. And so you've got basically a very simple choice. Like, you're going to be put in a martial law state or similar by some sort of event, or they're going to rig it to such a degree that even skeptics are going to be like, oh, there's no way this person won. And not after the last 4 years. He didn't win the first time, but definitely there's no way he won this time. Like, what the hell is going on? Okay, we really are living in a Orwellian nightmare. But then that's not going to be acceptable at this point, because it's just going to be like, okay, like everything people thought was crazy has come true. We are living in a dystopia. We have no freedom. So screw it. Like, we're done at this point. And there's going to be a civil war, or just a war of all against all in the streets, which we're starting to see already. Or something even crazier, like a natural disaster, a cyber attack, a nuclear, real or imagined event, or an economic collapse where the dollar suddenly goes basically to zero overnight. And I mean, there's so many possibilities that we're not even considering that must happen. Like, one of the things I just said must take place in the next decade. But I don't think it's going to take a decade, Nico. I think it's going to take actually just a few more months from today.
Yeah. Well, on that cheery note, Michael.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I'm the guys who, the models are lining up with this. You said March 2025. That's the
that's
equinox.
What Babu said, and that's what Babu said.
Beginning of
right,
spring.
Right.
So I'm just very happy to be here to see this, because it's just so nuts. I just hope
it's
my
crazy
can get through, because I've not welcome back in the golden age.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, you might as well be here for the end of the Kali Yuga, because, I mean, even if you don't believe in reincarnation, or you believe this is all random, what are the statistical odds that you would be alive, not as an old man either, like alive in your good years, at the end of the worst period of human conscious reality? What are the odds of that? I mean, it's statistically very low. Like, and that you'd come in at this time period within 100 years of the end of the Kali Yuga, right?
So here's one for you as well. It's just something I'm thinking of. Is I'm trying to figure out why. Mm-hmm. Why is that there's so many people in the world at this time, and so we say. I mean, if you fly international, there seems to be an awful lot of space wherever I go. You fly over. I flew to Korea, South Korea once.
Oh wow!
There's nothing underneath here for about 8 hours. So anyway, if there is 8 billion people in the world, as we've been told, are these souls all reincarnating here? That's so many souls are reincarnating here at this time to see the final show. And then they will see it, and then everyone goes.
It could be.
And then
it could also be the case that, like Dolores Cannon used to say during many of her presentations, that the majority of people you see, like you were talking about traveling. So Dolores Cannon would say at an airport, 60% of people there are not conscious embodied souls. They're just energy sources that made an agreement to play a part as backdrop people within your reality, and that only a handful
NPCs.
of actual actually she said that, and she said that about 20 years ago, before NPC was like a popular word. But she literally said that the grand majority of people you see in crowds aren't actually real, on a soul journey of development. They're actually physically embodied NPCs that made a contract, which being an NPC was part of their soul contract on a limited level, but that they're not really on a journey, but they have to be here for part of the play called reality. So maybe that's part of it, like maybe a lot of these people you see right now in the media, and protesters and people, maybe even millions of people that have died in conflicts and things like this, weren't really present during that experience, but it was part of a learning, reality creating backdrop for other people to learn and get better, or learn from their mistakes. It could be one way to look at the world. I can't prove that, though. I don't know.
That's something I'm going to think about tonight. That's exactly right. I need to let you go. We've gone on for an hour and 45 minutes now.
We have.
Michael,
we have.
So I'll put all your deets up for the podcast, but if you want to talk about, tell us the name of your book, where they can find it, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, my book is Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy. And you can find it on Amazon. And I also have a website, Michael.
Well, that was Michael the Flem. He just dropped out. Great guy. Fantastic chat. So thank you very much for listening. Mr. Kindness _pod on Instagram, and Mr. Kindness on Twitter. All right. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Hello.